the dim light casting long shadows that flickered against the gray walls. The clank of metal echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of the life that had been stripped from him. His thoughts spiraled back to the day it all began, the day his world shattered into pieces. He could still vividly recall the sound of sirens, the faces of the officers who had stormed into his garage, and the weight of their accusations, heavy as lead. "David Holloway, you're under arrest for the murder of Harold Jensen," one of the officers had said, his voice devoid of any warmth. The words had struck him like a physical blow, leaving him breathless. Now, as he sat in solitude, he closed his eyes and allowed the memories to wash over him. He had been a mechanic, a simple man with a humble life, devoted to his work and to his little girl, Lily. She was his everything, a bright spark in his otherwise monotonous existence. He remembered the way her laughter filled the air, how her smile could light up the darkest of days. "Daddy, can you fix my bike?" Lily would ask, her eyes wide with anticipation. "Of course, sweetheart," he would reply, ruffling her hair. "Just give me a minute." In those moments, life had felt perfect. He had never imagined that in a matter of days, he would be sitting on death row, his life on the line for a crime he didn't commit. The weight of despair threatened to crush him, but he clung to the hope that somehow, someone would uncover the truth. A soft knock on the cell door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see the guard standing there, his expression unreadable. "Holloway, you have a visitor," he announced, his voice echoing in the small space. David's heart raced. Could it be Lily? The thought of seeing her again filled him with a mix of joy and dread. He stood, smoothing down his prison-issued jumpsuit, trying to erase the signs of wear and tear from his appearance. As the guard led him to the visitation room, David felt his stomach twist with anxiety. The sterile, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting an unsettling brightness that contrasted sharply with the gloom of his cell. He stepped into the small room, and there she was, Lily, sitting at the table, her small hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Daddy!" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with emotion. "Hey, baby," he replied, forcing a smile. He sat down across from her, his heart aching at the sight of her fragile frame. She had grown since the last time he saw her. The innocence of childhood was slowly being replaced with a weight far too heavy for a girl of her age. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes searching his for reassurance. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired," he lied. The truth was that he felt anything but fine. The impending execution loomed over him like a dark cloud, and every day spent in that cell eroded his spirit just a little more. "Mom says they're trying to help you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it true? Are you really innocent?" David felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent countless nights rehearsing the words he would say to her, but now they escaped him. "I am, Lily. I promise you. I didn't do it," he said, his voice steadying. "There's been a mistake. I'll find a way to prove it." Lily's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and the sight pierced him like a knife. "I believe you, Daddy. I know you're not a bad man." "Thank you, sweetheart. That means everything to me." He reached across the table, taking her small hand in his. The warmth of her touch ignited a flicker of hope within him. "You have to stay strong for me, okay? Don't lose faith." "I won't. I promise," she declared fiercely, her small face set with determination. "I'm going to tell everyone that you're innocent. I'm going to make them listen." David smiled at her bravery, but inside, he felt a gnawing sense of helplessness. He wanted to protect her from the harsh realities of the world, but he was the one trapped in this nightmare. "I don't want you to worry about me. Just focus on school and your friends. You need to keep living your life." "But I can't just sit back and do nothing," Lily protested, her voice rising with frustration. "They can't kill you, Daddy. You have to fight back." "I am fighting," he reassured her, though the weight of the truth hung heavily on his shoulders. "I'm doing everything I can." As they continued to talk, David felt the conversation drifting toward the memories they had shared. The trips to the park, the evenings spent watching movies, the bedtime stories. Each recollection was a bittersweet reminder of what he was losing. "I miss you," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I miss you too," she cried, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I want you to come home." "I want that too, more than anything," he whispered, fighting to hold back his own tears. "But I need you to be strong for me. Can you do that?" Lily nodded vigorously, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I'll be strong, Daddy, I promise. We'll figure this out together." David squeezed her hand tightly, his heart swelling with love and pride. In that moment, he felt a burst of determination. He couldn't let her down. He wouldn't allow this injustice to take him away from her. As their visit drew to a close, the guard returned to escort David back to his cell. He stood, reluctant to leave the warmth of his daughter's presence. "Remember what I said, Lily. Stay strong," he urged her once more. "I will, Daddy. I love you," she called as he was led away. "I love you too, sweetheart," he shouted back, his voice echoing in the hallway. Back in his cell, the oppressive silence settled in once more. David leaned against the cold wall, his mind racing with thoughts of how to prove his innocence. He had to believe that there was still time, that someone out there would seek the truth, even if he was locked away behind bars. As the days faded into night, he found himself lost in contemplation. The world outside continued to turn while he remained a prisoner, trapped in a web of lies. But the memory of Lily's unwavering faith ignited a fire within him. He would not go quietly into that night. He would fight, not just for himself, but for her, and for all those wrongfully accused. With resolve etched in his heart, he began to plan his next move, determined to uncover the truth before it was too late. Sarah Mitchell sat hunched over her desk, the dim light of her office flickering from an old lamp. The clutter of papers and coffee mugs surrounded her like a fortress against the chaotic world outside. But her mind was far from settled. She had spent countless hours poring over the details of David Holloway's case, and an unsettling thought had taken root in her mind. The evidence that had convicted him might not be as solid as everyone believed. The hum of the fluorescent lights above her created a low buzz, but it was the silence of her thoughts that prompted her to dig deeper. She had recently learned about an old surveillance video from the night of the murder, a piece of evidence that had somehow escaped the scrutiny of the trial. Her heart raced as she recalled the whispers she had picked up from local sources, rumors that suggested the footage might show David miles away from the crime scene. If the rumors were true, it could change everything. With determination, Sarah grabbed her jacket and headed out the door. The night air was crisp as she made her way to the local police station. She felt a mix of anxiety and excitement coursing through her veins. The town was quiet, the streets illuminated only by the soft glow of streetlights. As she approached the station, she noticed the flickering neon sign that read, "Open." She took a deep breath and pushed the door open, the sound of the bell jingling above her head. Inside, the station was bustling with activity. Officers moved about, their voices a mixture of urgency and camaraderie. Sarah approached the front desk, where a weary-looking officer sat, tapping away at a computer. "Excuse me, officer," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I'm looking for information about a surveillance video related to the Holloway case." The officer looked up, a hint of skepticism in his eyes. "You sure you want to be poking around in that? The trial's over and the verdict was clear." "I understand, but I believe there might be evidence that wasn't considered," she insisted. "I need to see that video." With a heavy sigh, the officer glanced around before leaning closer, lowering his voice. "Okay, but you didn't hear this from me. The video is in the back storage room. I'll let you in, but you have to be quick." He motioned for her to follow him, and they navigated through the maze of cubicles and desks until they reached a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." He swiped his badge, and the door clicked open. The storage room was dimly lit and filled with boxes piled high, some labeled and others haphazardly stacked. The officer pointed to a cabinet in the corner. "It should be in there. Just be careful." As Sarah rifled through the cabinet, her heart raced with anticipation. She finally found the video cassette tucked between two dusty files. It felt like a treasure, a glimmer of hope in her quest for justice. She thanked the officer and hurried back to her office, her mind racing with the possibilities that lay ahead. Once inside her office, she quickly set up her old VCR. The machine whirred to life, and she inserted the tape. The screen flickered, and soon the grainy footage of the street outside the crime scene appeared. Sarah's heart pounded as she leaned closer, straining to see the details. The video showed a timestamp, and with each frame, she felt a rush of urgency. Suddenly, she saw him, a figure in a dark jacket, walking at a brisk pace, clearly heading away from the scene of the crime. She squinted, trying to capture every detail. The figure looked familiar, but it was the timestamp that caught her breath. It was the exact time of the murder, and David Holloway was nowhere in sight. "That's not him," she whispered to herself, a wave of relief flooding over her. The realization ignited a fire within her. She had to confront District Attorney James Caldwell with this evidence. It was crucial. The next morning, Sarah stood outside the grand courthouse, the morning sun casting long shadows on the steps. She felt a mix of trepidation and resolve as she approached the imposing building. Her heart raced with the fear of confrontation. Caldwell was known for his aggressive tactics and refusal to acknowledge any challenges to his authority. As she entered the building, the smell of polished wood and stale coffee filled the air. She approached the reception desk, her nerves tingling. "I'd like to speak to Mr. Caldwell, please. It's urgent." The receptionist raised an eyebrow but nodded, picking up the phone. "I'll see if he's available." After a brief wait, she was ushered into Caldwell's office. The DA sat behind a large mahogany desk, his demeanor exuding confidence and power. His suit was impeccably tailored, and his steely gaze met hers with a mixture of curiosity and irritation. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, leaning back in his chair, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Mr. Caldwell, I have crucial evidence regarding David Holloway's case," she stated, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. She placed the video cassette on his desk. "This surveillance tape shows he was miles away from the crime scene when the murder occurred." Caldwell's expression shifted, his eyebrows furrowing slightly as he reached for the tape. "You think you can just waltz in here with some old footage and overturn a conviction? It doesn't work that way." "I'm not trying to overturn anything without due process," she countered. "But you have to admit this evidence is significant. How can you justify executing an innocent man?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "You need to understand something, Ms. Mitchell. The system isn't as simple as black and white. David Holloway was convicted for a reason, and I'm not going to let you undermine that. I suggest you back off before you get in over your head." Her pulse quickened as he glared at her, the weight of his threat hanging in the air. "I'm not going to back down, Mr. Caldwell. David deserves a chance to prove his innocence. If you refuse to investigate this evidence, I'll take it to the press." "Go ahead," he said, a smirk creeping onto his lips. "But know this. I have connections, and the last thing you want is to make an enemy of me in this town." As she left his office, Sarah's heart sank. She had expected resistance, but the sheer arrogance of Caldwell left her shaken. However, she couldn't allow fear to dictate her actions. David's life depended on her tenacity. Later that evening, back in the prison, David sat on the edge of his cot, the weight of despair pressing down on him. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously, casting eerie shadows across the small cell. He had been staring at the wall for what felt like hours, lost in thoughts of his daughter, Lily. The thought of her growing up without him gnawed at his heart. As he stared blankly, a fellow inmate approached, an older man with a scruffy beard and wise eyes. "You okay, Holloway?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. David looked up, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." The inmate nodded knowingly. Yeah, I get that. This place has a way of making you reflect on your life. I used to think about my last words. Last words? David echoed, intrigued. Yeah, the man said, sitting down across from him. They say you can say anything you want before you go. I've heard some guys get real sentimental, while others use it as a chance to spit some truth. It's a powerful moment. David considered this. What would you say? I'd tell my family I love them, that they should keep fighting for justice. Life's too short to let it slip through your fingers. His words struck a chord in David. He had always imagined his last moments would be filled with regret and sorrow, but perhaps there was a way to reclaim his narrative. I've been thinking about that too, David admitted. If I get a chance, I want my words to matter. Then make 'em count, the inmate replied, a glimmer of encouragement in his eyes. Don't let fear silence you. Even in your last moments, you can still fight. David nodded, a sense of determination rising within him. He realized that even in the depths of despair, he had a voice. If he had to face the electric chair, he would do it with dignity, making sure his last words echoed the truth of his innocence. He couldn't let the system win without a fight. As the night wore on, David sat in the dim light of his cell, contemplating what he might say. He had always been a man of few words, but now he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He would not let his story end in silence. He would speak for himself, for his daughter, and for all those who had been wronged. He would leave a legacy that could not be extinguished, even by death. As the sun began to set on the small town of Maplewood, casting long shadows over the streets, Sarah Mitchell sat at her cluttered desk, surrounded by stacks of papers, photographs, and notes. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and an urgency that seemed to pulse with every tick of the clock on the wall. With David Holloway's execution date looming just days away, she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. Determined to raise awareness and gather support, Sarah had decided to organize a rally. "Sarah, I think it's a great idea," her friend and colleague Mark said, glancing up from his own stack of paperwork. "But do you really think it will make a difference? The town is pretty split on the death penalty." With a resolute nod, Sarah replied, "It has to. People need to understand that David is innocent. If we can get enough voices behind him, maybe we can make the authorities take a second look at his case." Mark leaned back in his chair, skepticism etched on his face. "You know it won't be easy. Caldwell won't let this slip away quietly." "I know," Sarah said, her voice firm. "But this isn't just about David anymore. It's about exposing the flaws in our justice system. I can't stand by and watch an innocent man die." As the evening wore on, Sarah began drafting a press release to gather attention for the rally. She detailed David's case, the inconsistencies in the testimonies, and the evidence that had been overlooked. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, heart racing with each word. After finishing, she took a deep breath and sent it out to every local news outlet she could think of. The day of the rally dawned bright and clear, the air buzzing with anticipation. Sarah arrived at Maplewood Square early, setting up a small podium and arranging pamphlets that laid out the facts of David's case. Supporters began to trickle in, holding signs that read, "Justice for David" and "End the death penalty." The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of hope and defiance. As Sarah stood at the podium, she scanned the crowd, her heart swelling with gratitude as familiar faces appeared. Friends, family members, and even strangers who had learned about David's plight had come to lend their voices. She took a deep breath, adjusting the microphone. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady yet passionate. "We gather not just for David Holloway, but for the integrity of our justice system. Every day, innocent lives are at risk because of corruption and negligence. David deserves a chance to prove his innocence, and we will not back down until he gets it." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing off the buildings surrounding them. A young woman in the front row, tears glistening in her eyes, raised her hand. "What can we do to help?" Sarah smiled, encouraged by the question. We need to spread the word. Share David's story on social media. Write to your representatives. Let them know that we will not accept a system that allows an innocent man to be executed." As she spoke, Sarah moved through the crowd, engaging with supporters. She interviewed a few of them, capturing their thoughts on camera. "What brought you here today?" she asked an older gentleman named Mr. Thompson, who had worked with David at the garage. "I knew David for years," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's like a son to me. This whole thing is a nightmare. He wouldn't hurt a soul. We need to fight for him." Sarah nodded, her heart aching for the pain David's loved ones felt. "Thank you for sharing your story. Your words matter." Throughout the day, the rally gained momentum. Local news crews arrived, cameras rolling as Sarah passionately shared David's story. She highlighted the surveillance video that had surfaced, showcasing David miles away from the crime scene. "This evidence was ignored, and we cannot let them sweep it under the rug any longer," she declared, her voice rising above the crowd. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the square, Sarah felt a surge of hope. The community was rallying behind David, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of possibility. But in the back of her mind lingered the reality of the ticking clock. David's execution was still on the horizon, and time was running out. Meanwhile, in his prison cell, David Holloway sat on the edge of his cot, staring blankly at the wall. The sounds of the prison echoed around him, distant shouts, the clanking of metal doors, and the low murmur of conversations. But within him, a storm brewed, a mix of despair and determination. He had spent countless nights replaying the events that had led to his wrongful conviction, each recollection tightening the knot in his stomach. David could hear the faint whispers of hope brought by Sarah's rally, but the walls of his cell felt insurmountable. He picked up a pencil and a scrap of paper, his hands trembling as he began to write. The words flowed out of him, raw and unfiltered. "Dear Lily, if you're reading this, I want you to know how much I love you. Every moment I've spent with you is etched in my heart. I think of the times we would go fishing by the lake, your laughter filling the air. It's those memories that keep me going, even in this dark place. I don't know what will happen in the coming days. The thought of never seeing you again breaks me. You're my light, my reason to fight. Promise me you'll be strong, no matter what happens. I believe in you, and I know you'll do great things in this world. Always remember, I am innocent. I didn't do what they said I did, and I hope that one day you will know the truth." Tears welled in David's eyes as he wrote, the enormity of his situation weighing heavily on his heart. He carefully folded the letter, his mind racing with thoughts of his daughter. He wished he could hold her one last time, tell her everything would be okay, even if he didn't believe it himself. As he placed the letter carefully under his pillow, David leaned back against the cold metal of the cot. The shadows danced on the walls, and he closed his eyes, desperate for rest. But sleep eluded him, haunted by the knowledge that he might not have another chance to see Lily. Outside, the rally continued, the voices of supporters rising in a crescendo of hope and determination. Sarah stood among them, her heart full, but her mind racing with concern. She knew they were fighting against a powerful system, but she also knew they couldn't stop now. Together, they would fight for David Holloway, for justice, and for the truth that needed to be uncovered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a dusky glow over the small town, Sarah Mitchell clutched her phone tightly, staring at the message on the screen. An anonymous tip had come through, suggesting a witness who could potentially exonerate David Holloway. The urgency of the situation sent a rush of adrenaline through her veins. Time was slipping away, and she had to act quickly. "Where are you, Tom?" she murmured to herself, quickly typing the address from the tip into her GPS. She hopped into her car, her heart pounding as she drove through the winding streets. The quiet town seemed to hold its breath, the weight of impending doom hanging like a dark cloud. As she navigated towards Tom's last known location, her mind raced with questions. Who was this witness? Why hadn't he come forward sooner? And most importantly, could he really save David? Arriving at a rundown house on the outskirts of town, Sarah parked hastily, her mind focused on the task ahead. She knocked on the door, her knuckles rapping against the worn wood, and waited, her breath catching in her throat. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged man with weary eyes and a scruffy beard. "Who are you?" Tom asked, his voice rough and apprehensive. "Tom? I'm Sarah Mitchell. I'm investigating David Holloway's case. I received a tip that you might have information that could help him," she replied, urgency lacing her words. Tom hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear behind him. "I can't get involved. It's too dangerous," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, Tom. David's life is at stake. If you know something, you have to tell me," Sarah pressed, her determination shining through. "They have the wrong man on death row, and I believe you can help prove it." He shifted nervously, biting his lip. "I saw it, all right. I saw the real murderer leaving the scene that night. But I was scared. I didn't want to end up like David." Sarah felt a surge of hope. "What did you see?" "Please, we don't have much time," she urged, stepping closer. Taking a deep breath, Tom finally relented. "I was walking home when I noticed a car parked near the alley behind the bar. A man got out, and he looked like he was in a hurry. I recognized him. He was always hanging around with the businessman. I saw him leave right after the gunshots." "Do you remember his name?" Sarah asked, her pen poised over her notepad. "Yeah, it's..." Tom started, but suddenly stopped, his eyes darting nervously again. "No, I can't. If Caldwell finds out I talked, he'll make sure I regret it." "Caldwell?" Sarah repeated, her mind racing. James Caldwell, the district attorney, had been vocal in his conviction of David. He's been covering this up, hasn't he? "I don't know what else to say. I was approached by someone from his office after the murder. They told me to keep my mouth shut, that it was in my best interest," Tom confessed, his voice trembling. "Tom, if you come forward, we can protect you. This isn't just about David anymore. It's about the truth," she insisted, her heart pounding with the urgency of their conversation. "I can't," he replied, shaking his head. "I've seen what happens to people who cross him. I don't want to end up like that." "Like what? What have you seen?" Sarah pressed, trying to understand the depth of Tom's fear. "People disappear. Or worse, I can't risk my life for someone I don't even know," he said, backing away from the door. "Think about David's daughter, Tom. She's going to lose her father because of this. Do you want that on your conscience?" Sarah's voice softened, her eyes pleading. "You have the power to change everything." Tom's expression wavered, torn between fear and the weight of responsibility. I don't know," he stammered, glancing back into his house, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. "Just think about it. You don't have to decide right now," Sarah said, sensing his hesitance. "But if you do decide to come forward, I'll be right here to help you." With that, she turned to leave, but Tom's voice stopped her. "Wait, I can give you a name, but I can't be part of it. You have to promise me that." "Of course, I promise," Sarah replied, her heart racing. "The guy's name is Jake Thompson. He's always been close to the businessman. If anyone knows what happened that night, it's him," Tom confessed, his voice strained. "Thank you, Tom. You might have just saved an innocent man's life," she said, her gratitude spilling over. "But please think about coming forward. The truth needs to be heard." As Sarah drove away, she felt a mix of hope and urgency. She needed to find Jake Thompson and convince him to testify before it was too late. The execution was set for the following morning, and every passing minute was a reminder of the ticking clock. Arriving at a diner that served as a hangout for locals, Sarah scanned the room for Jake. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension. A few patrons glanced up from their meals, casting curious looks her way. She approached the counter, where a waitress was refilling coffee cups. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Jake Thompson. Do you know if he's here?" Sarah inquired, trying to keep her voice steady. The waitress narrowed her eyes, sizing her up. "What do you want with him?" she asked, suspicion lacing her tone. "I'm a journalist. It's about David Holloway's case," Sarah said, hoping to earn some trust. "I need to speak with him urgently." With a reluctant nod, the waitress gestured towards a booth in the corner. "He's over there, but good luck getting him to talk. He doesn't take kindly to strangers." Taking a deep breath, Sarah approached the booth where a scruffy man sat, nursing a beer. Jake looked up, a mix of annoyance and curiosity crossing his face. "What do you want?" he grunted, not bothering to hide his disdain. "Jake Thompson? I'm Sarah Mitchell. I'm investigating the Holloway case. I need to talk to you about what you know," she said, keeping her tone firm yet respectful. "Not interested," he replied, turning his gaze back to his drink. "Please, just hear me out. You could help save an innocent man's life," Sarah pressed, leaning forward. "Tom saw you the night of the murder. He wants to tell the truth." At the mention of Tom, Jake's expression shifted slightly, but he quickly masked it with indifference. "I don't know what you're talking about. I wasn't anywhere near that place." "Jake, this is bigger than just you and me. Caldwell's office is involved in a cover-up. If you know something, you have to come forward," Sarah urged, her voice rising slightly with urgency. "I don't want any trouble," he replied, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "Trouble is already here, Jake. David is facing execution tomorrow for a crime he didn't commit. You could change everything with just one statement." Jake's shoulders slumped slightly, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw a hint of fear in his eyes. "I don't know, lady. I'm not sure I want to get mixed up in this. You won't just be helping David. You'll be standing up for what's right. Think about it. What if it were you in his place?" Sarah pressed, her heart racing as she watched the internal battle play out on his face. "Maybe," he muttered, but it was clear he still wasn't convinced. "Please, Jake, just give me a chance to explain everything," Sarah said, her voice softening. "You have the power to make a difference. Don't let fear dictate your actions." As she spoke, she saw a flicker of resolve begin to build in his expression. The clock was ticking, and they had to reach a decision quickly. "I'll think about it," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's all I ask," Sarah replied, her heart pounding with the weight of their conversation. "Just remember, you're not alone in this." With that, she left the diner, feeling a mix of hope and determination. She had to get back to David and prepare to present the evidence that could save his life. The night was drawing in, and time was running out. As she drove back to the prison, the gravity of the situation pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she refused to give up. Sarah Mitchell's heart raced as she navigated the dimly lit corridors of the prison. The walls felt oppressive, closing in around her with every step she took. The weight of urgency pressed heavily on her chest, a constant reminder of the life hanging in the balance just a few floors above her. As she reached the warden's office, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. The warden, a tall man with a stoic demeanor, looked up from his desk as Sarah barged into the room. His eyes narrowed slightly, intrigued but wary of her sudden appearance. "Miss Mitchell, what brings you here at such a late hour?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. "Warden, I need to speak with you about David Holloway," she said, urgency lacing her tone. "I have new evidence that proves his innocence. We don't have much time." "New evidence?" The warden raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched on his face. "You're aware that the execution is scheduled for tomorrow morning? What makes you think I'll entertain this?" "Because it's the truth," Sarah replied, her voice firm despite the quiver of fear underneath. "I spoke with a witness, a man named Tom. He saw the real murderer leaving the scene, and he was too afraid to come forward until now because of threats from the district attorney's office. This could change everything." The warden leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He considered her words, his expression unreadable. "And why should I believe you, Miss Mitchell? You're a journalist, not a law enforcement officer. What guarantee do I have that this is legitimate? Sarah's frustration bubbled to the surface. Because I've been investigating this case for months. I've seen the inconsistencies, the corruption. David doesn't belong on that chair. He's innocent, and if you don't act now, you'll be complicit in a grave injustice. The warden's gaze softened slightly, the tension in the air shifting. I understand your passion, but this isn't a game. Lives are at stake, and I can't halt an execution based on a single claim without substantial proof. Then let me show you the evidence, she insisted, pulling a folder from her bag and setting it on his desk. It includes Tom's statement and the surveillance video that proves David was miles away from the crime scene. All I need is a chance for you to review it. The warden hesitated, glancing at the folder and then back at Sarah. I can't make any promises, but I'll look into it. Wait here. He stood up and walked out of the room, leaving Sarah alone with her racing thoughts. Moments felt like hours as she paced the small office, the weight of the world resting on her shoulders. She thought of David, strapped into that chair, waiting for an executioner to end his life. How had it come to this? Her mind was a whirlwind of images. David's loving smile, Lily's innocent faith in her father's innocence, the corruption that had led them to this moment. When the warden returned, he had a look of resolve on his face. I'll allow you a few minutes to present this evidence to the execution team, but understand, this doesn't guarantee anything. If they deem it insufficient, the execution will proceed as planned. Thank you, Sarah breathed, relief washing over her. She followed the warden through the maze of sterile corridors toward the execution chamber, her heart pounding with each step. The air grew colder, the atmosphere thick with despair. She could hear the muffled sounds of the world outside, a mixture of protests and fervent prayers echoing through the walls. As they approached the chamber, Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had seen enough of these places through her work to know the gravity of the situation. The stark, sterile room was lined with steel and shadows, and she caught a glimpse of David, his expression a mixture of resignation and fear as he sat in the electric chair, secured by leather straps. The sight sent a jolt of pain through her heart. "David," she called out, her voice breaking through the heavy silence. His head turned, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Sarah?" he asked, confusion etched across his face. "What are you doing here?" "We have to stop this," she said, rushing forward, clutching the folder tightly. "I have evidence that proves you're innocent. You can't go through with this." The execution team, a group of 4 men in dark uniforms, exchanged glances, their expressions inscrutable. The warden stepped forward, raising a hand to silence her. "Miss Mitchell, this is highly irregular. You need to step back." "No," she replied, desperation creeping into her voice. "If you proceed, you'll be executing an innocent man. Please, just look at the evidence." David's eyes widened, a flicker of hope sparking within them. "What evidence?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Tom's statement. He witnessed someone else leaving the scene. He was too scared to come forward until now. This could save you," she explained, holding out the folder as if it were a lifeline. "Enough!" the warden barked, his patience wearing thin. "We're following protocol here. You need to calm down." "No," Sarah's voice rose, echoing off the cold walls. "David's life is on the line. You can't let this happen. You're all part of this system that has failed him." As tension crackled in the air, David's gaze locked onto Sarah's, a mix of gratitude and fear shining through. "Sarah, if this is the last thing I hear, I want you to know I believe in you. I believe in what you're doing." The executioner, a grim man with an impassive expression, moved to his station, preparing the machinery. The atmosphere grew heavier, each second stretching painfully as the reality of the moment loomed larger. "Stop!" Sarah cried, her voice breaking. "Please, just give me a moment to present the evidence. You can't do this without at least considering the truth." With a heavy sigh, the warden glanced at the execution team, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "We can't delay this forever," he said, his voice low. "But I'll allow you to speak your piece. Just a moment." As she stepped forward, trembling with a mix of fear and determination, Sarah unfolded the papers. This is Tom's statement. He describes the night of the murder, how he saw someone else leaving the scene. He was intimidated into silence, but now he understands the weight of his words. This can't be ignored. The warden took the folder, his eyes scanning the pages as the tension in the room escalated. The executioner paused, glancing back at the warden, and the other men shifted uneasily, caught in the crossfire of morality and protocol. "Please," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Once this happens, there's no turning back. You can't bring David back. We owe it to the truth to investigate this fully." David's eyes shone with unshed tears, the gravity of the moment dawning on him. "Sarah, I trust you," he said, his voice a whisper, but his conviction resonated deeply within the chamber. As the warden deliberated, the weight of the decision hung heavily in the air. Sarah held her breath, praying that justice would prevail in these final moments. The world outside continued its fight, the echoes of protest and hope reverberating through the prison walls, a reminder that every life mattered and truth was worth fighting for, even in the darkest of times. The electric chair loomed ominously in the sterile execution chamber, a grim reminder of the finality that awaited David Holloway. Yet, in that moment, the air thick with tension and uncertainty, Sarah Mitchell stood defiantly in front of the warden, her heart racing. The execution had been halted, but the weight of the situation hung heavily in the room. As the warden, a stocky man with a furrowed brow, processed the urgency of Sarah's interruption, the atmosphere crackled with an unsettling mix of hope and dread. "Ms. Mitchell, you need to understand the gravity of what you're asking," the warden said, his voice low and gravelly. He glanced over his shoulder at the execution team, who stood frozen, their hands poised over the switches that could end David's life in an instant. "We're not equipped to handle last-minute evidence like this." "I understand that," Sarah replied, her voice firm, yet tinged with desperation. "But this evidence could save an innocent man's life. You have to look at it. We don't have time to waste." She thrust the envelope, containing the witness testimony and surveillance footage, toward him, her hands trembling slightly. The warden hesitated, his eyes flicking between Sarah and the execution team. The clock was ticking, and every second felt like a lifetime. David, strapped into the chair, felt the weight of every gaze upon him. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on the sound of Sarah's voice, grounding himself amidst the chaos. "Please, just take a moment to review it," Sarah implored, her voice rising slightly. "If you proceed with the execution, you'll be condemning an innocent man. This isn't just about protocol, it's about justice." The warden sighed, the tension in his shoulders visibly easing as he took the envelope from Sarah's hands. "All right," he said finally, his resolve wavering. "I'll take a look, but this better be solid evidence." As the warden stepped to the side, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. She could see David through the glass, his face a mask of anxiety and hope. She turned to him, offering a reassuring nod, though her heart raced. "You're not alone, David. We'll get through this," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if he could hear her. Time stretched painfully as the warden reviewed the contents of the envelope. The execution team shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other as the clock ticked down. Each tick seemed to echo louder than the last, amplifying the silence that enveloped the chamber. Sarah felt as if the world had narrowed down to this single moment, their fates intertwined in a dance of desperation and hope. Finally, the warden cleared his throat, his expression grave. "I need to confer with the legal team," he announced, turning on his heel and marching out of the room. The tension in the chamber grew thicker as the remaining guards exchanged anxious glances, unsure of what to expect next. As they waited, David's mind raced. Hope flickered like a candle in a storm, and he clung to it, desperate for a miracle. "Sarah," he called, his voice strained but clear. What if What if they don't believe it? What if they still go through with it? They have to believe it, Sarah said, her voice steady, though uncertainty gnawed at her. This evidence is crucial. We'll make them see the truth. She could see the fear in David's eyes, and it broke her heart. Just hold on, David. You have to believe in your innocence. Minutes felt like hours, but finally the warden returned, flanked by a couple of legal aides. His brow was furrowed with concern as he approached the execution chair. "We've decided to postpone the execution," he announced, his voice heavy with authority. "We need to investigate this evidence further." A wave of relief washed over David, and he closed his eyes, allowing the weight of the world to lift, even if just for a moment. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Sarah felt tears of relief prick at the corners of her eyes. "You're going to get your chance, David. We're going to prove your innocence." She stepped closer to him, her heart swelling with renewed hope. "We're not done fighting yet." As the guards unstrapped David from the chair, he felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, fear, and the lingering doubt that had shadowed him for so long. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Now we gather the evidence, confront the people who wronged you, and clear your name," Sarah replied, determination etching her features. "We'll bring Caldwell to justice." David's heart raced again at the mention of the district attorney's name. Caldwell had been the architect of his downfall, a man whose ambition had twisted the truth into a weapon. "He's the one behind all this, isn't he?" David said, a chill creeping down his spine. "He set me up." "Exactly," Sarah affirmed, her eyes blazing with conviction. "We'll expose his corruption. This isn't just about you, David. It's about everyone he's wronged." As the reality of the moment settled in, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had been given a second chance, and he wouldn't waste it. "Let's do it," he said, determination igniting within him. In the days that followed, the investigation unfolded with urgency. Sarah worked tirelessly, digging deeper into Caldwell's dealings, uncovering a network of corruption that had festered beneath the surface for too long. The community rallied around David, their voices rising in a chorus demanding justice. Then came the shocking revelation that would change everything. Sarah received a tip-off from an anonymous source who had been watching Caldwell closely. "He's been covering his tracks," the source whispered over the phone, a tremor in their voice. "But I've got proof. He's the one who orchestrated the whole scheme to eliminate Holloway." Sarah's heart raced as she took notes, piecing together the web of deceit. "What do you have?" she asked, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "There are documents, emails, things that show Caldwell knew the truth and buried it to protect himself," the informant explained. "He was afraid Holloway would uncover his corruption." With this new evidence, Sarah confronted Caldwell directly, armed with the truth. "You've been lying, Caldwell. You set David up to protect yourself from exposure," she accused, her voice unwavering. Caldwell's expression shifted from irritation to panic. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Don't I?" Sarah pressed, holding up the documents. "You thought you could get away with it, but the truth is coming out. You're going to pay for what you've done." As the walls began to close in on Caldwell, David watched from the sidelines, his heart racing with anticipation. The moment of reckoning was at hand, and he could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. In a shocking series of events, Caldwell was arrested, and the truth about his corruption came to light. David Holloway was finally exonerated, his name cleared after months of fighting for justice. As he stepped out of the prison for the first time in years, the sunlight struck his face, and he felt a rush of emotions. Waiting for him was Lily, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Daddy!" she cried, running into his arms. "I'm home, sweetheart," David whispered, holding her tightly. "I'm so sorry for everything." Lily pulled back to look at him, her expression fierce. "You're not just my daddy, you're a hero," she declared. David chuckled, the sound rich with relief and love. "No, Lily, I'm just a man who fought for his truth, and I promise to fight for anyone else who's been wronged like I was." With Sarah by his side, David knew that their battle wasn't over. They would ensure that justice prevailed, not just for him, but for all those who had been silenced. The fight against injustice was a long road, but they were ready to walk it together.